Chapter 10. The Cruise of the Coot. My father was not the only man in Saskatoon to know the frustrations and hungers of a landlocked sailor. There were a good many other expatriates from broad waters in the city, and he came to know most of them through his work, for on the library shelves was one of the finest collections of boating books in existence. Some of my father's staff, who did not know a boat from a bloat, were inclined to take a jaundiced view of the nautical flavor of the annual book purchase list, but after all, he was the chief librarian. Aaron Poole was one of those who appreciated my father's salted taste in books. Aaron was a withered and eagle-featured little man who had emigrated from the Maritime Provinces some 30 years earlier, and who, for 29 years, had been hungering for the sound and feel of salt water under a vessel's keel. The fact that he had originally come from the interior of New Brunswick and had never actually been to sea in anything larger than a rowboat during his maritime years was not relevant to the way Aaron felt. As a maritimer, exiled on the prairies, he believed himself to be of one blood with the famous seamen of the North Atlantic ports. And in 29 years, a man can remember a good many things that ought to have happened. Aaron's memory was so excellent that he could talk for hours of the times when he'd sailed out of Lunenburg for the Grand Banks, first as a cabin boy, then as an able-bodied seaman, then as a mate, and finally as a skipper of the smartest fishing schooner on the coast. Aaron's desire to return to the sea grew as the years passed, and finally, in 1926, when he was in his 65th year, he resolved his yearnings into action and began to build himself a vessel. He married off his daughters, sold his business, sent his wife to California, and got down to work at something that really mattered. He planned to sail his ship from Saskatoon to New Brunswick, and he intended to sail every inch of the way. He was of that dogged breed who will admit no obstacles, not even geographical ones, like the 2,000 miles of solid land which intervened between him and his goal. He designed his ship himself, and then turned the basement of his house on Fifth Avenue into a boatworks. Almost as soon as her keel was laid, some well-meaning friend pointed out to Aaron that he would never be able to get the completed ship out of his basement. But Aaron refused to be perturbed by problems which lay so far in the future. By the time we arrived in Saskatoon, Aaron and his boat had been a standing jest for years. Her name alone was still enough to provoke chuckles in the beer parlors, even among those who had already laughed at the same joke 100 times. It was indicative of Aaron's singular disdain for the multitudes that he had decided to name his ship the Coot. "What's the matter with that?" he would cry in his high-pitched and querulous voice. "Heck of a smart bird, the Coot. Knows when to dive, knows when to swim. Can't fly worth a hoot. Who wants to fly a boat?" Aaron's tongue was almost as rough as his carpentering, and that was pretty rough. He labored over his ship with infinite effort, but with almost no knowledge and with even less skill. Nor was he a patient man, and patience is an essential virtue in shipbuilding. It was to be expected that his vessel would be renamed by those who were privileged to see her being built. They called her the Putty Princess. It was appropriate enough. Few, if any, of her planks met their neighbors, except by merest chance. It was said that Blandings Hardware, where Aaron bought his supplies, made much of its profit during the years the Coot was a-building from the sale of putty. When my father and Aaron met, the Coot was as near completion as she was likely ever to get. She was 24 feet long, flat-bottomed, and with lines as hard and awkward as those of a harbor scow. She was hogged before she even left her natal bed. She was fastened with iron screws that had begun to rust before she was even launched. The gaps and seams in her hull could swallow a gallon of putty a day and never show a bit of it by the next morning. Yet, despite her manifold faults, she was a vessel, a ship, and the biggest ship Saskatoon had ever seen. Aaron could see no fault in her, and even my father, who was not blinded by a creator's love and who was aware of her dubious seaworthiness, refused to admit her shortcomings, because she had become a part of his dreams too. Mother and I were expecting it, when one March day, Father announced that he was taking a leave of absence for the library that coming summer in order to help Aaron sail the Coot to Halifax. Saskatoon as a town took a keen interest in the project. Controversy as to the Coot's chances for a successful journey waxed furiously amongst the most diversified strata of society. The Chamber of Commerce hailed the venture with the optimism common to such organizations, predicting that this was the trailblazing step that would lead to great fleets of cargo barges using Mother Saskatchewan to carry her children's grain to the markets of the world. On the other hand, the officials of the two railroads made mock of the Coot, refusing to accept her as a competitive threat in the lucrative grain-carrying business. But on the whole, the city was proud that Saskatoon was to become the home port for a sea-going ship. Maps showing the vessel's route were published, along with commentaries on the scenic beauties that would meet the eyes of the crew along the way. It was clear from the maps that this would be one of the most unusual voyages ever attempted, not excluding Captain Cook's circumnavigation of the globe. For in order to reach her destination, the Coot would have to travel northward down the South Saskatchewan to its juncture with the northern branch, then eastward into Lake Winnipeg. From there, the route would turn south to leave Manitoba's inland sea for the waters of the Red River of the north and the territories of the United States. Continuing southward down the Minnesota River to St. Paul, the Coot would find herself in the headwaters of the Mississippi, and on that great stream would journey to the Gulf of Mexico. The rest of the trip would be quite straightforward. A simple sail around Florida and up the Atlantic coast to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Sailing time, announced by banner headlines of the local paper, Mowat and Poole to sail with morning tide, was fixed for 8 a.m. on a Saturday in mid-June, and the chosen point of departure would be the mudflat which lies near the city's major sewer outlet on the river. The actual launching had to be postponed a day, however, when the ancient and gloomy prediction that Aaron would have trouble disentombing the Coot from his basement was found to be a true prophecy. In the end, a bulldozer had to be hired, and Aaron, with the careless disdain of the true adventurer, ordered the operator to rip out the entire east wall of his house so that the Coot might go free. The crowd, which had gathered to see the launching, and which at first had been disappointed by the delay, went home that evening quite satisfied with this preliminary entertainment and ready for more. Father and Aaron had reason to be thankful for the absence of an audience when they finally eased the vessel off the trailer and into the Saskatchewan. She made no pretense at all of being a surface ship. She sank at once into the bottom slime, where she lay gurgling as contentedly as an old buffalo in its favorite wallow. They dragged her reluctantly back on shore, and then they worked the whole night through under the fitful glare of gasoline lanterns. By dawn, they had recalked the Coot by introducing 9 pounds of putty and a great number of cedar wedges into her capricious seams. They launched her again before breakfast, and this time she stayed afloat. That Sunday morning, the churches were all but deserted, and there was a gala crowd that lined the river shores to the windward of the sewer. The mudbank was the scene of frantic activity. Father and Aaron dashed about, shouting obscure orders in nautical parlance, and became increasingly exasperated with one another when these were misunderstood. The Coot waited peacefully, but there were those among us in the crowd of onlookers who felt she hardly looked ready for her great adventure. Her deck was only partly completed. Her mast had not yet been stepped. Her rudder fittings had not arrived, and the rudder hung uncertainly over the stern on pintles made of baling wire. But she was colorful, at least. In his hurry to have her ready for the launching, Aaron had not waited for the delivery of a shipment of special marine enamel, but had slapped on whatever remnants of paint he could find in the bottom of the cans that littered his workshop. The result was spectacular, but gaudy. Both Aaron and Father had been the recipients of much well-meaning hospitality during the night, and by morning neither was really competent to deal with the technical problems of storage. The mountain of supplies and gears which had accumulated on the mudbank would have required a whole flock of Coots to carry it. Captain and mate bickered steadily, and this kept the crowd in a good humor as the hours advanced, so the moment of departure seemed no nearer. The patience of the onlookers was occasionally rewarded, as when Aaron lost control of a 50-pound cheese, a gift from a local dairy, and went spinning off into the flow from the sewer. The audience was entranced. Aaron danced up and down on the mudflat, shrilly ordering his mate to dive in and rescue the cheese, but the mate became openly mutinous, and the situation was only saved by the prompt action of 2 small boys armed with fishing poles, who caught the truant cheese and steered it gently back to shore. They would not touch it with their hands, nor would anyone else, and long after the Coot had sailed, the cheese still sat on the mudflat, lonely and unloved. Mutt was prominent during these proceedings. He had been signed on as ship's dog, and the excitement attendant on the launching pleased him greatly. When willing hands finally pushed the Coot out into the stream, Mutt was poised on the foredeck, striking an attitude, and he was the first part of the deck cargo to go swimming when the overloaded vessel heeled sharply to starboard and shook herself free of her encumbrances. The Coot was dragged back to the mudbank once again. Mutt withdrew under the growing mountain of discarded supplies for which there was no room aboard the ship. It was not so much the sewer that had discomfited him as it was the heartless laughter of the crowd. Just before noon, they sailed again at last, and the Coot looked quite impressive as she swung broadside to under the arches of the new bridge, accompanied by a flotilla of 36 sodden loaves of bread that had fallen through the bottom of a cardboard container which Aaron had retrieved from the wet bilges of the boat and had incautiously set to dry upon the canted afterdeck. Riding my bicycle along the shore path, I accompanied them for a mile before waving farewell and then returning to the city, where, with the rest of Saskatoon, I settled down to await reports of the Coot's progress. Our newspaper had outdone itself to cover the story properly, for it had enrolled all the ferrymen along the river as special correspondents. The ferries were located every dozen miles or so. They were square scows, fitted with submerged wooden vanes that could be turned at an angle to the current, so the water pressure on them would force the ferries back and forth across the river, guided and held on their course by steel cables that were stretched from shore to shore below the surface. The ferrymen were mostly farmers, with little knowledge of wider waters than their own river, so the newspaper representative who visited them, himself a fugitive from a seaport town, had given each of them a careful briefing on the proper manner in which to report commercial shipping. When, for 5 full days after the Coot left us, there was not a single report from a ferryman, we began to worry a little. Then, on Friday night, the operator of the first ferry below the city, some 15 miles away, telephoned the paper in a great state of agitation to report an object, unidentifiable due to darkness, that had swept down upon him just before midnight, and then after fouling the ferry cable, had vanished again to the sounds of a banjo, a howling dog, and a frightful outpouring of nautical bad language. The mysterious object was presumed to be the Coot, but the reporter was dispatched to that section of the river at dawn and could find no trace of the vessel. He drove on downstream and at last encountered a Ukrainian family living high on the riverbank. The farmer could speak no English, and his wife had only a little, but she did the best she could with what she had. She admitted that she had certainly seen something that morning, and here she stopped and crossed herself. It had looked to her, she said, like an immense and garish coffin that could never have been intended for a mere human corpse. When she saw it first, it was being hauled across a broad mud flat by, and she crossed herself again, a horse and a dog. It was accompanied, she continued, by 2 nude and prancing figures that might conceivably have been human, but were more likely devils. Water devils, she added after a moment's thought. No, she had not seen what happened to the coffin. One glance had been enough, and then she'd hurried back into her house to say a prayer or 2 before the family icon, just in case. The reporter descended to the river, and there he found the marks left by the cortege in the soft mud. There were 2 sets of barefoot human tracks, a deep groove left by a vessel's keel, and 1 set each of horse and dog prints. The tracks meandered across the bar for 2 miles, and then vanished at the edge of a navigable stretch of water. All the tracks vanished, including those of the horse. The reporter returned to Saskatoon with his story, but he had a strange look in his eye when he told us what he had seen. As to what had actually happened during those 5 days when the Coot was lost to view, my father's log tells very little. It contains only such succinct and sometimes inscrutable entries as these. Sunday, 12:40 hours. Sink again. Sunday, 2200 hours. Putty all gone. Try mud. No good. Wednesday, 1600 hours. Aaron shot duck for dinner. Missed. Hit cow. Thursday, 2330 hours. Rudder gone west. Friday, 1200 hours. Thank God for horse. But the story is in there nevertheless. It was in an amiable and buoyant mood that Father and Aaron last saw Saskatoon. That mood remained on them for 3 miles, during which they made reasonably good progress, being forced to make for shore, before they sank, only 4 times. At each of these halts it was necessary to unload the Coot and turn her over to drain the water out. Aaron kept insisting that this would not be necessary in the future. She'll soon take up water, she told my father. Wait till she's been afloat a while. As the day grew on, the initial mood of amity wore thin. She'll take up all right, my father remarked bitterly as they unloaded the Coot for the 12th time. She'll take up the whole danged river before she's done. That's what she'll do. By the time they established their night camp, they had covered a total distance of 6 miles, and the Coot had lost what little putty remained in her. Her crew slept fitfully that night. On Monday, there was little difficulty in keeping the water out, since there was no water, only a continuous sandbar. It was a terrestrial day, and they hauled the Coot the entire 2 miles they made good before sunset. The 3 days which followed were of a similar nature. Mutt began to get footsore from sand between his toes. Because they spent so much of their time slithering and falling in the river muck, they attempted to haul the Coot as little further on her way. Both Father and Aaron abandoned clothing altogether and went back to nature. They kept making new discoveries about their vessel and her equipment, and these were almost all discouraging. They found that in the monstrous pile of stores left behind in Saskatoon had been the fuel for the stove, the ammunition for the shotgun, though not, alas for an innocent cow, for the .22 rifle, the axe, and blackest of all omissions, 3 bottles of good Jamaica rum. They found that most of their soft rations were inedible because of prolonged immersion in sewage water, and they found that their sodden blankets were in an equally unsanitary state. They found that all the labels of the canned goods had been washed away, and they discovered that the 2 cases of gleaming but nameless cans which they had supposed held pork and beans actually held dog food intended for Mutt. I do not wonder that the log had so little to say about those days. I only wonder that the Coot continued on her voyage at all. But continue she did, and on Thursday evening her crew was rewarded by at last reaching relatively navigable waters. It was nearly dusk by then, but neither mate nor skipper, both of whom become grim and uncommunicative, would be the first to suggest a halt, and Mutt had no say in the water. They pushed the Coot off the final sandbar and slipped away downstream into the darkness. At midnight they fouled the ferry cable and lost their rudder. The loss was not so serious as it seemed to them at the time, for before dawn they were aground again, and again trudging over the mudbanks, the tow ropes gnawing into the bare shoulders while the Coot obstinately dragged her keel. They had paused for a while to cook a dismal breakfast when my father, happening to glance up at the high bank, saw the horse. Inspiration came to him, and he leaped to his feet, shouting with elation. He was no longer shouting when, having hiked 5 miles over the burning prairie in order to find the horse's owner and arrange for a temporary rental, he came wearily down the banks of the river to rejoin the Coot. Aaron greeted him with unwonted joviality and a momentous announcement. "I found it, Angus," he cried, and held aloft one of the 3 precious bottles that had been given up for lost. This was the turning point of the journey. By noon, the amiable horse had dragged the Coot across the 2-mile flats to open water once again. Aaron allowed the horse to wade a little ways from shore in order to float the Coot. He was about to halt the beast in order to untie the tow rope when my father's genius renewed itself. "Why stop him now?" Father asked. Aaron looked at his mate with growing affection and passed the bottle. "By God, Angus," he said, "for a librarian you've got quite a brain." So the Coot proceeded on her way again, under 1 horsepower, and since the river seldom was more than 3 feet deep, the horse experienced but little difficulty in his strange roll. When, as occasionally happened, he struck a deep hole, he simply swam until he could touch bottom again. And when the water shoaled into a new sandbar, the Coot's passengers jumped ashore and helped him haul. The use of a river horse was a brilliant piece of improvisation, and might well have sufficed to carry the voyagers to Lake Winnipeg, where they would assuredly have drowned, had it not been for the flood. When the rain began on Saturday afternoon, Father and Aaron took the Coot to shore, hauled her a little way up the flats, covered her with a big tarp, and crawled underneath the canvas to wait out the downpour. The horse was turned loose to scale the high banks and forage for himself, while the 2 men and the dog relaxed cozily in their shelter over tins of dog food and dollops of red rum. The rain grew heavier, for it was the beginning of one of those frightening prairie phenomena, a real cloudburst. In less than 3 hours, 3 inches of water had fallen on the sun-hardened plains about Saskatoon, and that was more than the total rainfall during the previous 3 months. The ground could not absorb it, and the steep-sided gulches leading to the valley of Saskatchewan began to roar angrily in spate. The river rose rapidly, and growing yellow and furious as the flow increased. The first crest of the flood reached the Coot at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and before her crew could emerge from their shelter, they were in midstream and racing down the river at an appalling clip. Rudderless, and with only 1 remaining oar, for Aaron had used the other to support a tea pail over an open fire a few days earlier and had then gone off to sit and think and forgotten about the oar and the tea and the fire, there was nothing useful that the Coot's crew could do to keep themselves. The rain still beat down upon them, and after a brief stunned look at the fury of the river, they sensibly withdrew under their canvas hood and passed the bottle. By 7 o'clock, the rain had moderated to a steady drizzle, but the flood waters were still running. In Saskatoon, we who waited impatiently for the news of the Coot were at last rewarded. The arrangements made by the newspaper began to bear fruit. Reports began arriving from ferrymen all down the river, and these succeeded one another so swiftly that at times they were almost continuous. The telephone exchange at the newspaper office was swamped with messages like this one. "Special to the Star. Sailing vessel Coot, outbound in ballast from Saskatoon, sighted at Indian Crossing at 7:43 p.m. on course for Halifax. That is if she doesn't go busting into the Big Island bar before she gets past Coyote Creek." But the Coot did get by Big Island and Coyote Creek all right, for at 7:50 p.m. the watcher at Barnersford reported that she had just passed him, accompanied by 2 drowned cows, also presumed to be en route for Halifax. At 8:02, she went by Indian Crossing. At 8:16, she sideswiped the Sinkhole Ferry. At 8:22, she was reported from St. Louis, Saskatchewan, not Missouri, and so it went. The ferryman tried to speak to the speeding ship, but she gave them no reply and would not even deign to make her number. So swiftly did she pass that a hard-riding stockman who spotted her near Duck Lake could not even draw alongside. In the city room of the newspaper, reporters marked each new position on a large-scale map of the river, and somebody with a slide rule calculated that if the Coot could maintain her rate of speed, she would complete her passage to Halifax in 6 more days. By 9 o'clock that evening, the darkness of an overcast and moonless night had so obscured the river that no further reports could be expected from the watching ferrymen. However, we presumed that on Sunday morning the observers would again pick up the trail. A number of people even drove out at dawn from Prince Albert to see the Coot go past the junction of the 2 branches of the river. They made that trip in vain. The flood passed and the river shrank back to its normal idleness self, but no Coot appeared. She had vanished utterly during the black hours of the night. All through that tense and weary Sunday, we waited for news and there was none. At last, Aaron's son-in-law called in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for help, and the famous force ordered one of its patrol aircraft up to make a search. The plane found nothing before darkness intervened on Sunday evening, but it was off again the following dawn. At 11 a.m. Monday, the following radio message was received in Saskatoon. Coot located 5 miles northwest Fenton and 2 miles from Riverbank, aground in center of large pasture and entirely surrounded by Holstein cows. Crew appears all well, 1 man playing banjo, 1 sunbathing, and dog chasing cattle. This was an admirable report and indicative of the high standards of accuracy combined with brevity for which the force is justly famed. However, as my father later pointed out, it did not tell the entire story. Mutt, Aaron, and father had spent the whole of Saturday night under the cover of their tarp. Even after the rain stopped, they did not emerge. Father said that this was because he wished to die bravely, and he could do so only by ignoring the terror and turmoil of that swollen river. Aaron said it was because they found the 2nd bottle of rum. Mutt, as usual, kept his peace. When light grew strong on Sunday morning, Father began to hope that they might yet survive, and pulling aside the canvas, thrust his head out for a look. He was stupefied by what he saw. The Coot had evidently managed to cover the entire distance to Lake Winnipeg in less than 10 hours. His bemused mind could find no other explanation for this apparently limitless expanse of brown water that stretched away on every side. It was not until late afternoon, when the floodwaters began to subside and the tops of poplar trees began appearing alongside the Coot, that the illusion was partially dispelled. It vanished totally by Monday morning, when the voyagers awoke to find their vessel resting on a broad green meadow surrounded by a herd of curious cattle. The crew of the Coot now proceeded to enjoy the happiest hours of their journey. There was no water in the boat or under her. There was no sand and no mud. The sun was warm. Aaron had found the 3rd bottle of missing rum, and Father had procured a side of home-cured bacon and 5 loaves of homemade bread from nearby Doukhobor settler. Mutt was having a grand time with the cows. It was a fair and lovely place for storm-tossed mariners to drop their hook. The ideal was disturbed by the appearance of the search aircraft, and shattered a few hours later by the arrival of Aaron's son-in-law's passenger in a big red truck. A conference was called, and the cruise was declared to be at an end, despite Aaron's blasphemous dissent. The Coot went ignominiously home to Saskatoon aboard the truck. When he was safely within his own house, Father frankly admitted to us that he was delighted to be there and that he had never really had much hope of seeing home again. For the rest of that summer, he was content with Conception, and we spent many a happy weekend on Lotus Lake, sailing her back and forth between the Anglican Church Beach and Milford's Beer Parlor. But there is a curious postscript to the story of the Coot. One day in the autumn of the following year, my father received a letter from Halifax. It contained nothing save a snapshot, which showed a funny little craft, unmistakably the Coot, tied up alongside that famous Lunenburger, the Blue Nose. On the back of the snapshot was a cryptic message scrawled large in purple ink. "Quitter," it said. Father would have felt badly about that, had not his friend Don Chisholm, who was assistant superintendent of one of the railroads in Saskatoon, shown him a waybill sometime earlier. It was an interesting document. It dealt with the dispatch of 1 flat car with cargo out of Saskatoon bound for Halifax. And the name bestowed upon that flat car for the journey by some railroad humorist was written large at the bottom of the bill. It was the Cootie Carrier.